All right, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into what has to be one of the most unexpected, honestly kind of wild chain reactions in modern North American politics. We usually think of international trade disputes, like tariffs on steel or vehicles, as these massive, abstract concepts debated by folks in suits in capital cities. But today, we're going to see how those high-level macro battles are actually having a direct impact on something literally right in our own backyards. We are talking about the actual ground where we bury our garbage.
So, keep this question in the back of your mind as we go through this. What do international tariffs have to do with where your trash ends up? It seems like a massive leap, right? But by tracing this huge kind of hidden supply chain that runs straight across the US-Canadian border, we're going to connect the dots between the White House, the Ontario Premier's office, and a sleepy, dormant landfill in a small farming town. Here is our roadmap for today. 1. The looming trade war. 2. The transnational waste corridor. 3. Michigan's pushback. 4. The domestic capacity crisis. And finally 5. Bill 5 and Dresden.
Part 1. The looming trade war, shifting alliances and border friction. Okay, to understand this garbage crisis, we really have to rewind and look at how rapidly trade friction escalated in Washington and Ottawa. Back in February 2025, U.S. President Donald Trump signed executive orders threatening near-universal 25% tariffs on Canadian goods. It was a huge deal. And in response, by March, Ontario actually retaliated with a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to border states like Michigan and New York, before things eventually de-escalated. But it just brilliantly illustrates the high-stakes brinkmanship we were seeing. Then, fast forward to July 2026, the United States refused a long-term renewal of CUSMA, the Canada-US-Mexico agreement. Instead, they moved the treaty to a system of rolling annual joint reviews. So practically overnight, that guarantee of long-term trade stability, completely gone.
Right in the middle of all this uncertainty, Ontario Premier Doug Ford took some proactive steps. In June 2026, he led a delegation down to Washington, D.C. to pitch what his office called Fortress North America. It was basically this bold vision to deeply integrate North American supply chains and champion tariff-free trade to protect the regional economy. But here's the thing. While all these diplomats were busy talking about autos and agriculture, they were also acutely aware of another, massive, totally different kind of cross-border export.
Part 2. The transnational waste corridor, the hidden export.
So, zooming in from the macro trade war, we find this highly vulnerable yet absolutely massive transnational supply chain, municipal solid waste. Just look at the sheer scale of these numbers. This is data pulled directly from Michigan's fiscal year 2024 solid waste report. Canada is sending over 3.46 million tons of waste into the state. To put that into perspective for you, Canada is by far the largest source of imported waste to Michigan. It totally dwarfs neighboring states like Ohio and Wisconsin. In fact, Canadian garbage makes up over 14% of all the waste disposed of in Michigan's landfills. That is wild. So you might be wondering, why on earth is Ontario trucking millions of tons of trash across an international border? Well, the answer comes down to literal pocket change. 36 cents. That is the exceptionally low per-ton landfill tipping fee levied by the state of Michigan. It's basically rock bottom compared to anywhere else. And because industrial, commercial, and construction waste in Ontario is managed by private companies, they just follow the economics. It is simply way cheaper for private waste haulers to drive Ontario's garbage all the way across the border than it is to dispose of it at home.
Part 3. Michigan's pushback, closing the dumps.
Now, as you can probably imagine, Michigan residents aren't exactly thrilled about being the cheapest dumping ground in North America. It turns out, literal garbage makes for a surprisingly contentious geopolitical bargaining chip. Recognizing the problem, Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer tried to step in. She proposed a massive hike in the state tipping fee, aiming to raise it from that 36 cents all the way up to $5 per ton. The goal there was twofold: drastically kill the economic incentive for out-of-state dumping, and then use that new revenue to actually fund local environmental cleanups and recycling initiatives across Michigan.
But the crucial point here is, why didn't that fee hike happen? Well, international trade rules are complicated. In this crazy twist of irony, under SUSMA, waste is officially classified as an exempt commodity. What that means is, if Michigan tried to put targeted border tariffs strictly on Canadian garbage, they'd be violating international trade laws. So if Michigan wanted to raise fees on Canada, they legally had to raise fees on their own in-state businesses too. And as you'd expect, that sparked fierce opposition from Michigan's own manufacturing and municipal lobbies. Ultimately, the Michigan Senate just outright rejected the $5 fee increase in their July 2026 budget, meaning the cheap waste corridor stayed wide open.
Part 4. The domestic capacity crisis, running out of room. Because Michigan's doors stayed open, Ontario managed to dodge an immediate catastrophe. But let's take a look at why Ontario is so desperate to keep that border open in the first place. Back in 2024, Ontario landfilled 12.75 million tons of waste. Now, 73% of that was managed domestically, sure, but a staggering 27% was exported to the United States. That means more than a quarter of the province's entire waste management system is relying completely on foreign disposal.
And here is the real ticking clock. While Ontario's overall waste generation has been going up, their available provincial landfill capacity has actually dropped by 18%. According to industry reports, Ontario could run out of landfill space in just 9 years. 9 years! So think about it. If the U.S. border were to suddenly close to garbage tomorrow, whether through a new trade war tariff or a Michigan policy change, Ontario wouldn't just be facing higher costs, they would be facing an immediate, literal infrastructure crisis. They simply have nowhere to put it.
Part 5. Bill 5 and Dresden, the local fallout.
So we've gone from macro trade wars down to transnational waste corridors, down to provincial capacity limits. Now let's zoom all the way in to see exactly how this plays out in one local Ontario community. In June 2025, the Ontario government passed Bill 5. It's officially called the Protecting Ontario by Unleashing Our Economy Act, and this legislation did something pretty huge. It gave the provincial cabinet unprecedented authority to establish what they call special economic zones. Inside these zones, the government has the power to completely override local municipal planning acts and just bypass standard provincial environmental regulations to fast-track development.
One of the very specific targets of this bill was a dormant landfill site in the small town of Dresden, Ontario, which had been purchased by a company called York 1. The province used Bill 5 to explicitly remove the requirement for a comprehensive environmental assessment for the site's expansion. And Premier Doug Ford was actually very open about why. He publicly justified the move by pointing directly to geopolitical security. He argued that Dresden landfill expansion was absolutely necessary to protect Ontario's domestic capacity, just in case U.S. President Donald Trump decided to close the border to Ontario's garbage. However, as you can imagine, fast-tracking infrastructure by bypassing environmental laws triggered some intense backlash. First Nations leaders stepped up, arguing that the government was bypassing constitutionally protected treaty rights by just removing these consultation processes. Grand Chief Alvin Fiddler made a very powerful statement in response to Bill 5. He said, "I think after today, we need to look at every option that is at our disposal, including taking direct action. Everything is on the table." And it wasn't just First Nations leaders. Environmental and civil liberties groups echoed these exact same concerns, calling the legislation an anti-democratic overreach. So right now, ground zero for this entire geopolitical mess is a local recycling and waste facility in Dresden. York 1 bought the dormant site back in 2022. Bill 5 came in and cleared away the environmental assessment hurdle in 2025. But the local Chatham-Kent Municipal Council has formally opposed the project. First Nations and local residents are actively fighting it on the ground. And as a result, the whole project is now tangled up in major Superior Court challenges set for September 2026. Basically, what started as an effort to solve a high-level trade vulnerability has resulted in massive, grinding domestic legal battle. Which really brings us to our final thought. I mean, we started this explainer talking about international tariffs, and we ended up in a courtroom fighting over a local dump in Dresden. It brilliantly and kind of terrifyingly illustrates how deeply interconnected our world really is. But it leaves us with a pretty critical question for the future. With CSUSMA no longer this guaranteed long-term treaty and instead subject to these unpredictable rolling annual reviews, can a long-term strategy for North American waste infrastructure ever truly be stable? Or are our local environments just destined to remain bargaining chips in a continuous cycle of global trade uncertainty? Something to think about the next time you throw something in the bin. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this helped you see the hidden connections shaping our world.